It was a suffocating July evening in 1962, the kind of New York summer night that clings to your skin and seeps into your bones. Inside the hushed, opulent confines of a private dining room within a discreet midtown Manhattan brownstone, the air hung thick and heavy, not just with the humid oppression of the city, but with the cloying aroma of expensive cigar smoke and a tension so palpable it felt like a physical weight on the polished mahogany table. 5 men sat around it, their faces grim, etched by years of calculating silence and unspoken power plays. These were the architects, the bedrock of the American underworld, assembled for a meeting that would not be recorded in any official ledger, but would echo through the history of organized crime for decades to come. Across from them, Frank Cheech Costello, his face a map of 1,000 secrets and 1,000 sleepless nights, began to speak. His voice was a low rumble, barely rising above the murmur of the distant city traffic, yet every word carried the weight of an empire. He laid out the demand, not his own, but that of Charlie Luciano, the exiled visionary, from his gilded cage in Italy. Luciano wanted a prime piece of the lucrative numbers racket in South Brooklyn, a territory that bordered the interests of no less than 3 powerful families, and he wanted it for a man named Joseph "Joey" Numbers Johnson. As Luciano's long-standing proxy, Costello underscored the gravity of the request by placing a heavy, ornately carved silver cigarette case on the table's gleaming surface. It was more than an object. It was a silent symbol, a gleaming testament to the exiled boss's enduring, almost mythical presence. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was an active, breathing thing, stretching for almost 2 full minutes. In that room where fortunes were decided and lives often ended with a nod, 2 minutes was a lifetime. Every breath was measured, every glance charged with unspoken questions. Then Carlo Gambino, a man whose eyes were like chips of granite, leaned forward. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the thick air like a razor wire, sharp and absolute. "This ain't 1931 anymore, Frank," he said, his gaze fixed on Costello, then briefly flicking to the silver case. "And Johnson ain't no Lucky Luciano." The words hung in the air, a chilling, impossible refusal. This wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was a defiant rejection of the very man who had engineered the commission itself, the founding father of their modern syndicate. History books, in their neat, tidy summaries, often gloss over the true magnitude of that moment. They tell you what Luciano demanded, and that it was refused, but they rarely tell you why. What unseen strings were being pulled? What unspoken truths were laid bare in that smoke-filled room, forcing the most powerful council in organized crime to turn its back on its creator? This wasn't merely about a few blocks in Brooklyn or the millions they could generate. This was about a seismic shift in power, a quiet coup that would redraw the entire landscape of the American mafia. And at its heart, Joseph "Joey" Numbers Johnson, a man who believed he was on the cusp of greatness, became the unwitting sacrifice in a battle for the very soul of the syndicate. To understand that unprecedented refusal, that tectonic plate shift beneath the city's seemingly stable surface, we have to rewind to the threads that were already unraveling long before that sweltering July night. At the epicenter of this brewing storm was Charles "Lucky" Luciano himself, the visionary exiled far across the Atlantic in Italy. His genius was undeniable. It was his mind that had forged the commission, bringing an end to the brutal Castellamarese War, unifying the disparate factions into a formidable, disciplined force. Even from afar, his influence was a shadow stretching across the ocean, his reputation an almost sacred text. But time and distance, as any king in exile eventually learns, come at a steep cost. His chosen pawn in this particular maneuver, Joseph "Joey" Numbers Johnson, was a man of raw, unbridled ambition. He carried himself with the swagger of a man destined for more, favoring flashy suits and prone to a quick temper that often outran his judgment. But beneath the surface, a quiet vulnerability simmered, a gambling debt, far deeper than anyone suspected, owed to figures in the distant Chicago outfit. A secret liability, an open wound just waiting to be exploited. The true antagonist, however, wasn't a single man operating in the shadows, but a rising tide of new power within the commission itself, particularly embodied by Carlo Gambino. Gambino was a master of patience, a quiet strategist who understood that true power wasn't seized in a burst of violence, but accumulated through subtle manipulation and an iron will. He saw Luciano's demand for the South Brooklyn territory not as a testament to enduring loyalty to the founder, but as an audacious overreach, an attempt to assert authority from a past era that had long since passed its expiration date. Gambino's objective was crystal clear: to consolidate the Commission's power, to assert its independence as a truly collective entity, and to subtly, irrevocably, diminish Luciano's operational control. And Johnson, with his checkered past, his aggressive posturing, and his inconvenient compromising debts, was the perfect target to make a larger, more profound point. The context of the late 1950s and early 1960s was crucial to understanding this delicate dance. It was a period of profound transition. The old guard, hardened by the bloody lessons of the Castellammarese War, was slowly, inexorably giving way to a new generation of bosses. These men had learned to navigate a different world, the booming post-war economy, yes, but also the increasing unforgiving scrutiny of federal law enforcement. The Commission, once an extension of Luciano's will, a mechanism to prevent internecine warfare, had evolved. It was now a powerful entity in its own right, a council of equals, or at least near equals. What was truly at stake in that room wasn't just the millions generated by the numbers racket. It was the very authority, the very autonomy of the Commission itself. A yes to Luciano's demand would set a dangerous precedent, signaling that an exiled boss, separated by an ocean and decades, could still dictate terms, effectively undermining the collective power of the five families. A no, however, risked open defiance, a move that could shatter the fragile, hard-won peace Luciano himself had established. The consequences of either choice were immense, a precipice upon which the future of the syndicate now teetered. The threat, the quiet pressure from Luciano, had been building for months. Restless in Italy, feeling his influence wane, he had been pushing for Johnson, a capo whose loyalty he valued, to expand his operations. Johnson, emboldened by Luciano's distant backing, had begun making preliminary moves, subtly encroaching on territories traditionally held by other families, particularly those aligned with Gambino. This aggressive posturing, fueled by Johnson's own ambition and Luciano's blessing from afar, felt less like a simple request for expansion and more like a gauntlet thrown, an inevitable, heavy-handed imposition that challenged the new order. The chessboard, it seemed, was meticulously being set for a confrontation that no one explicitly desired, yet everyone understood was unavoidable. In the days leading up to that fateful commission meeting, a meticulous campaign of whispers began to circulate. These weren't overt accusations, but carefully managed, subtly amplified stories spread by Gambino's extensive network. Tales of Johnson's recklessness, of his past failures to kick up his full expected share to the family, began to gain traction, but most damning, most insidious, were the quiet revelations about a significant, undisclosed gambling debt he owed. Not to a local bookie, but to a powerful figure within the Chicago outfit. This wasn't merely a personal failing. This was a fundamental compromise, a vulnerability that could and would compromise any territory he controlled, exposing it to outside influence and potential instability. These weren't just rumors. They were carefully leaked truths, designed with precision to sow distrust and dismantle Johnson's credibility from the inside out. The what was said next wasn't a single explosive statement, but a calculated clinical dismantling of Johnson's suitability, piece by agonizing piece. Gambino, with the quiet but firm support of other powerful bosses like Stefano Magaddino and Joseph Bonanno, meticulously laid out the case. Johnson, they argued, was not an asset, but a profound liability. He was a loose cannon, prone to erratic decisions, and if granted this lucrative South Brooklyn territory, he would inevitably spark a bloody turf war. A war that would not only destabilize the fragile peace Luciano himself had worked so hard to establish, but also expose them all to increased federal scrutiny. It was a brilliant, almost cruel strategic move, turning Luciano's own legacy, his commitment to peace and stability, directly against his chosen man. As the arguments mounted, logical and irrefutable, the ornate silver cigarette case sat untouched, its symbolic power slowly draining away, reflecting back only the grim faces of men who understood that a new era was dawning. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a chilling, unanimous silence. When the vote was called, when the moment came to either affirm or deny the will of the exiled king, not a single hand rose in favor of Johnson. The refusal was absolute, total. It was delivered not as an insult to Luciano, at least not explicitly, but as a unanimous decision for the good of all families, a testament to the Commission's collective wisdom, its newfound independence. Costello, a man who understood the nuances of power better than most, seeing the indelible writing on the wall, quietly picked up Luciano's silver cigarette case. Its gleaming surface now reflected a different kind of power, a power that had shifted subtly but decisively to the men in this room. He returned to Luciano with the message, not of outright defiance, but of a new, stark reality. Joseph "Joey Numbers" Johnson, his ambition publicly crushed, simply vanished from the upper echelons of the syndicate, relegated to a forgotten corner of the underworld, his name becoming a quiet, chilling cautionary tale whispered among those who still dared to dream too big. In the immediate aftermath, the city reacted with a quiet understanding, a subtle rearrangement of its unseen levers of power. Within 72 hours, the South Brooklyn territory, the very prize Luciano had sought, was quietly reallocated. It was split, not given to one ambitious capo, but between two less aggressive, more reliable figures from different families, ensuring no single power gained too much. The message was clear, unmistakable. The commission was no longer a rubber stamp for an exiled king. Luciano's influence, while still respected for his past accomplishments, was now firmly limited to advice, to counsel from afar, never again to direct commands. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, solidifying the authority of the new generation, particularly Carlo Gambino, who had masterfully asserted the Commission's independence without firing a single shot. In this world, power isn't about who you once were, but who controls the room now. Influence is a currency that depreciates with distance, and when the old lions roar from afar, the young wolves learn to hunt closer to home. Was this a necessary assertion of autonomy or a cold betrayal of its founder? The answer, as always in this world, lay not in loyalty, but in who truly held the reins of power when the moment of truth arrived. The air in the private dining room, already thick with cigar smoke and unspoken accusations, now vibrated with a different kind of energy. It was the calm before a storm, or perhaps the quiet before an execution. Carlo Gambino had laid out his case with surgical precision, dissecting Joseph Johnson's ambition, his recklessness, and most damningly, his hidden debt to the Chicago outfit. Each point was a nail in Johnson's coffin, hammered in not with force but with irrefutable logic, and the quiet assent of the men around the table. The silver cigarette case, Luciano's emblem, still sat untouched, gleaming under the low light, a silent, impotent witness to the dismantling of its owner's will. Then came the moment. The silence deepened, becoming almost sacred in its intensity. Frank Costello, Luciano's long-standing proxy, looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each face. He knew what was coming, could feel the tide of history turning beneath his very feet. He had delivered Luciano's demand, watched the arguments unfold, and now he had to perform the final, agonizing rite. He straightened slightly, his eyes still holding a hint of the old power, but his shoulders now bearing the weight of a new reality. The unspoken question hung in the room, heavy and unavoidable. Would they honor the architect of their peace, or would they assert their own hard-won authority? When the call for the vote was made, it was not a thunderous declaration, but a quiet, almost imperceptible nod from Costello, a reluctant ushering of the inevitable. And then, the ultimate defiance. Not a single hand rose in favor of Johnson. The refusal was absolute, total. It was a unanimous silence that spoke louder than any shouted argument, a collective act of sovereignty that solidified the Commission's independence. It wasn't an act of disrespect to Luciano, at least not overtly. It was presented as a unanimous decision for the good of all families, a testament to their collective wisdom, their evolving mandate. The decision, delivered through that chilling absence of support, was less a personal insult and more a cold, calculated declaration of a new world order. In that moment, the delicate balance of power, carefully maintained for decades, irrevocably shifted. Costello, his face a mask of resignation, slowly reached out and picked up Luciano's silver cigarette case. The action was deliberate, heavy with symbolism. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet surrender on behalf of his exiled boss, a stark recognition that the days of dictatorial commands from across the Atlantic were over. The gleaming case, once a symbol of Luciano's enduring reach, now merely reflected the grim, determined faces of the men who had just seized control of their own destiny. The news, when it reached Joseph "Joey Numbers" Johnson, was delivered not by a formal envoy, but by a chilling silence that emanated from the very top. His phone calls went unanswered. His subtle attempts to expand his operations were met with immovable walls. His ambition, once a roaring fire, was publicly crushed, leaving only ashes. Johnson didn't disappear in a hail of bullets or with a dramatic public fall. He simply vanished from the upper echelons of the syndicate, relegated to a forgotten corner of the underworld, his name becoming a quiet, chilling, cautionary tale whispered among those who still dared to dream too big, or more dangerously, to rely on distant favors. He became a ghost in his own life, a man whose potential was extinguished not by violence, but by a simple, unanimous vote. The domino effect was swift and precise. Within 72 hours of that fateful meeting, the lucrative South Brooklyn territory, the very prize Luciano had sought for Johnson, was quietly reallocated. It wasn't given to a single, ambitious capo, which would have risked sparking new conflicts. Instead, it was meticulously split between two less aggressive, more reliable capos, each from a different family. This strategic division ensured no single power gained too much, reinforcing the Commission's new mandate: collective stability above individual gain. It was a clear message, unmistakable in its intent. The Commission was no longer a rubber stamp for an exiled king. Luciano's influence, while still respected for his past accomplishments, was now firmly limited to advice, to counsel from afar, never again to direct commands. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, solidifying the authority of the new generation, particularly Carlo Gambino, who had masterfully asserted the Commission's independence without firing a single shot, using logic and consensus as his weapons. The legacy of that sweltering July evening in 1962 reverberated for years. It marked the definitive end of an era, a quiet coup that reshaped the American mafia. Luciano, the genius who built the house, found his blueprint revised, his authority diminished by the very council he had created. Gambino, the quiet strategist, had ascended not through bloodshed, but through patience and a profound understanding of the evolving landscape of power. In this world, power is a currency that depreciates with distance. Loyalty, when tested, often bends to the prevailing wind of self-interest and survival. The story of Joseph Johnson, a man who believed he was on the cusp of greatness, serves as a stark reminder. When the old lions roar from afar, the young wolves learn to hunt closer to home. Was the Commission's refusal a necessary assertion of autonomy or a cold betrayal of its founding father? Perhaps it was both. In the end, it was a brutal lesson that true authority isn't inherited or commanded from a distance. It is earned, defended, and ultimately held by those who control the room, now. If this untold history, this struggle for the soul of the syndicate, caught your attention, then hit that like button. What are you waiting for? Subscribe to join our crew and never miss another dive into the shadows of history. Tell us in the comments, do you think the Commission was right to defy Luciano, or was it a cold betrayal of their founder? Share this story with someone who understands that power plays aren't just in the headlines, they're in the quiet rooms where decisions truly get made. And don't go anywhere, because the next tale from the hidden archives is even more insane. Turn on those notifications, you won't want to miss it.